First of all, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the first panel session at QED. Thanks for coming along. It's my pleasure to introduce this panel, which is going to be on the theme of reaching out reasonably. My name's Janis Bennion. I'm a member of the Greater Manchester Skeptics Society. I also am co-organising this conference, and I run Ladies Who Do Skepticism events in Greater Manchester. And it's really a pleasure to be here today alongside some of the most experienced and interesting people, at least who I know of, in their field. And I know a lot of people in their field because I've been reading about it a whole lot recently. I don't mind telling you that it's actually really overwhelming to be moderating a panel like this. People who I've got such great regard for, and yet people who are some of the most personal people that I've actually met. And I wonder if there's some kind of coincidence involved in that. So anyway, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves to you, and then we're going to have some questions from on the panel, and then we're going to open it out to you a little bit after that. So let's start with Eugenie.
Well, good morning. First of all, I'm very impressed with this conference because here you all have just come up from the previous morning session. You managed to get your coffee and get up here and start on time. I mean, do you realize how unusual this would be in an American conference? I mean, this just doesn't happen. I'm really impressed. This is going to be a great meeting. Well, I'm the director of the National Center for Science Education in Oakland, California. And we are the monitors, if you will, of the creationism and evolution controversy in the United States and elsewhere. We have been consulted by people trying to keep religious views out of science classes, not just in the United States, and not just in Canada, and not just in Australia, but anyway, many parts of the world. I got interested in skepticism, oh gosh, I don't know, probably 30 or more years ago. Yes, I'm very old. Largely through the creationism and evolution controversy. And that was my introduction to the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, or SICOP, Skeptical Inquirer, and that whole movement there. From my interest in the creationist form of pseudoscience, I got interested in pseudoscience of various kinds and the difference between the way scientists look at and ask questions about things and how many members of the general public look at such things. So I've sort of gone from creationism to pseudoscience in general to science as a way of knowing, and all of this in my mind blends.
Hi, I'm Kylie Sturgess of the Token Skeptic podcast. I'm a writer, a researcher. My master's degree is on the measurement of paranormal beliefs. My podcast is called The Token Skeptic. I write for the SciCop website a column called Curiouser and Curiouser. I'm a religious education and philosophy teacher who married her dungeon master. So, and my introduction to skepticism was when I had my honeymoon at the Amazing Meeting 3 in Las Vegas.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm Sile Lane, and I'm Campaigns and Public Liaison Manager at Sense About Science, who are a small charity who are founded to make sense of science and evidence for the public and promote good science and evidence and the tools of scientific reasoning in public debate. And we do this by working with our database of 4,000 specialists, some of whom I see before me today, to do all that and to chase down pseudoscience wherever we find it. And I think working together with scientists like that, we've shown that some of the activities we do can change public debate. For example, in the award-winning campaign I've worked on with patient groups and carers to make sense of dodgy treatments and therapies being promoted on the internet, and the campaign to reform the libel laws that I'm coordinating, and things like our annual Celebrities in Science review, which gets things like critical thinking and the tools of scientific reasoning into gossip columns and music mags and on local radio where you'd never normally get these things. So I think my experience of working at Sense About Science, I would say that we definitely need to get out there because it really can change public debate.
My name's David Kirby. I'm a senior lecturer in science communication just down the road at the University of Manchester. Although my background is in evolutionary genetics, that's what I got my PhD in, molecular population genetics. Taught evolution and molecular biology at American University for a while, and then got interested in questions related to science in the media, particularly, but generally science and culture, and figured, well, if I wanted to do good work in this, I had to understand the methods that people use to study in the humanities and social sciences. Did a retraining postdoc at Cornell University in communication studies, And my work is on, I'm interested in science communication in general, but I'm interested in science communicated through entertainment media. And I just heard from my publisher last night that my book on scientists who consult on Hollywood films is actually out as of yesterday. And I have some flyers if anyone's interested in that type of topic. It's never too early to shill for your book. But what I'm interested in today is what can we learn from the science communication community about skeptical outreach?
Okay, so obviously reaching out recently. Thanks, Andy. This is Andy Wilson, by the way, also an organiser of QEDCon. Welcome to join in at any time. So, of course, reaching out, there's many different forms of outreach, and I'm sure that a lot of people in this room have got different ideas about what outreach is. So I'd be interested to know, considering your own view of what outreach is, how many people in the room feel that they already do some form of outreach? Okay, so it's quite a lot of you, and I'm sure that you all got into outreach for different reasons. And obviously, the first step would be getting into science or skepticism. So my first question for the panel is how they became interested in science and skepticism, and also, maybe some insight in how that turned into science outreach. And I think I'd like to start that with Sile.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm a scientist by training. My undergrad and my PhD degrees are in neuroscience, developmental neuroscience, and then in Ireland. And then I moved to the UK and I worked as a postdoc in Imperial College for years in a stem cell group. So I love stem cells. I think the most interesting thing in the world. And a lot of the time during my research with stem cells, I was, of course, speaking to the public about it and talking about the potentials and the pitfalls of stem cells and the moral issues and so on. And I found myself doing that more and more and more as I became more and more senior postdoc and less in the lab. But I loved it, and I absolutely loved helping people make sense of what stem cells can do and what science can do, and just giving them the tools to understand whether the next time they read a piece in the Daily Mail about the next cure for Parkinson's with stem cells, whether they, helping them make sense of the status of that research and what's going on, and whether it's something they should try if they have the disease that they're talking about. So I was coming to a natural end to my career as a postdoc, I think. And I saw a job at Sense About Science, and a job advert for that. In fact, my boss saw a job at Sense About Science and gave me the job advert and said, you should do this. This is what you do as a hobby anyway. Why don't you get out there and talk to even more people, get out of the lab and get out. So I did, and I don't regret it a bit. I absolutely love science and research, and I still love stem cells and think they're the best in the world. They're going to save us all if they don't kill us first. But I know that I'm not an expert in stem cells. I mean, I was a postdoc, and I know that I don't know everything about them. But I do know that I know probably a lot more science than most of the rest of the general public. And I know what the tools of scientific reasoning are, and I know how to make sense of science stories and claims about products and claims about evidence. And I feel like I have a responsibility to get out there and help other people understand that too. So that's why I left science and joined science outreach.
I think it's quite common for scientists to become involved in outreach, but I also know there's other. It can happen quite often the other way around, that you get interested in science and then you kind of go into skepticism and into that kind of path. And I think Kylie, your path into outreach was, I think it's slightly different with your background.
I first became interested due to childhood experiences watching a very popular TV show on Australian television called The Investigators, which was looking at consumer rights and fighting for consumer rights for people out there. They would write into the program and they would do an investigation. There was and still continues to be, a very popular magazine called Choice Magazine. I believe you might have a variety of consumer rights magazines worldwide, and I'm certain that there's a UK equivalent. And my parents subscribed to that, and I used to read that all the time. They still continue to have a popular website. So consumer rights interested me, about how not being ripped off, not being misled, frauds, how people were willing to fight for these kinds of rights. And I guess another aspect was comedians. Many of my friends at high school were fans of bands and music. I was a fan of comedians, and there were quite a few iconoclastic comedians out there who were willing to push the boundaries. Tim Minchin, for example, comes from my hometown, and he's a classic example of someone who challenges the boundaries of, well, what's accepted and what's believed and how far we can question it. When I became a teacher, I started a master's degree looking at special learning needs and gifted and talented education, and so I became interested in psychology in that regard, and eventually the two of them just sort of gelled together. Yeah.
And I think, David, I'm interested in how you feel about skepticism and critical thinking outreach in terms of how that's different from the scientific outreach that you're used to doing with, and that you lecture on.
Well, I think one of the differences is when you think about skepticism, right? I mean, as skeptics, we're interested in people using reasoning, right? And science is the sort of perfect model. Scientists use reasoning, empirical evidence to make decisions. But in a sense, we can't necessarily conflate the two, right? I mean, skepticism can also be applied in many other areas, right? I mean, media literacy is something that I'm really interested in. I mean, if you're following the what's happening in Egypt at the moment, okay, if you're listening to Fox News, right, you're getting a totally different viewpoint. So teaching media literacy from a skeptical perspective is important. So when we think about it, okay, science and skepticism are in some ways, they're cousins, but they're slightly different. So if you look at today's earlier session, Bruce Hood, beautiful outreach about skepticism and critical thinking, right? Based on neurobiology, right? But that's a skeptical outreach session. If you talk about neurology and outreach, okay, that's not necessarily talking to people about critical thinking. You could be talking just about the ways in which neurons interact or the way channels open up and do various things, right? So there's a difference between a scientific outreach event and skeptical outreach when you're trying to really teach people or get them thinking critically. Science is good for that, but most science outreach things don't actually go for that type of thinking.
So would any of the rest of the panel like to comment on this question?
I agree. I absolutely agree with what you said, David. A lot of science outreach seems to be about telling the public about the latest research or trying to make science fluffy and acceptable and happy and friendly to people. For example, there is an unnamed scientific body based in the UK who spent a lot of money putting together a brochure trying to get people interested in chemistry by saying things like, we're all chemists really, because we bake bread in our kitchen and that's chemistry. We're all chemists. We're all in this, we're all a bit of chemists really. But that's not very helpful when a mother comes across, just yesterday in the newspapers I read about Giselle, the model, saying she doesn't put sun cream on her skin because it's full of chemicals, and she doesn't use anything that's synthetic, so she actually doesn't use sun cream, and she called it poison. I don't put that poison on my skin because there's chemicals in it. So how does a brochure saying, we're all chemists really, help someone make sense of whether putting sun cream on your skin or not is going to be dangerous?
Well, actually, that might be a first step. I mean, in a way, I haven't seen, I don't know who Giselle is, and I haven't seen the brochure, but we have similar things in the States, of course. In fact, probably the American Chemical Society does the exact same thing. There is a role for helping the public understand that science is a friendly endeavor. I mean, there is a lot of perspective about science, that it's something scary, only done by specialists, only done by those people, only done by most people have never met a scientist. They wouldn't know they wouldn't know one if they fell over it in the street. But and so science is something that's sort of distant and remote and doesn't have anything to do with me. So maybe if science associations did more of that sort of thing, like, well, gee, we're all chemists. Did you know that baking bread is chemistry? A lot of people say, no, I didn't know that. And, maybe that's a way of desensitizing people a little bit. It probably, and David would have much more knowledge about this than I would, it may not be terribly effective, but I think the idea behind it is useful. There's this one definition of science that I've run into, it's not really a definition, a description of science, is that science is organized common sense. And I kind of like that in a way, because it does tend to make science more accessible and more friendly. At the same time, I know that the approach of science, which is really a critical thinking approach, where you're trying to answer a question, and the way you go about it is that you get some ideas about answering that question, and then you actually go out and test those ideas and see whether you're right or not, and rinse and repeat. And it's this iterative aspect of science where you're constantly going back, is there another explanation? That is not intuitive, okay? Science is organized common sense. When you flip on the switch and the light doesn't go on, what do? Well, most people don't stand there shaking a rattle and dancing to try to make the electricity gods make the light go on. You go and you see if it's plugged in, and then you check the bulb. That kind of organized science, organized common sense is something that, if we could get people to understand that, that's really science. That's not something remote and untouchable that only experts do. And yet, at the same time, the actual process of employing the scientific endeavor, as it were, is really not something that people do routinely. So we have a lot of educating to do, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it seems like it's important to have like a human face to science and to show that it's accessible, but at the same time, to try and make people think about what's behind the things that you're telling them, and not just to go for the chemistry of bread and then jump to chemicals are bad because of sun cream, but to actually to go more into these. It's great to have, for example, celebrities who are interested in promoting the science behind things rather than the other way, rather than actually denigrating it. And I suppose that's something certainly that you're interested in, Sheila. I know that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, every year at Sense About Science we do our annual Celebrities in Science review, where all through the year we're collecting instances of celebrities saying things about science, good or bad. Yeah. We started early this year with Giselle yesterday, which was fantastic. She was in her last year's one as well, because she doesn't give chemical baby foods to her babies, and she thinks everybody in the world should be forced to breastfeed. There are some problems with that, I'm sure. But yes, we do that. It's fairly light-hearted, and we have a whole lot of fun in the office when people send us in celebrities saying daft things. And some of the daft things celebrities say probably do more damage to their reputation than to the larger public debate, to be fair. But some things celebrities say, they go very, very far. Yeah. They go around the world very, very quickly. And when someone starts...
vaccination. Yeah.
And when someone Googles, for example, this last year, Nadia Sawalha, she's an actress in the UK, not very well known, but she's an actress, said she never...
I don't even know actresses in the US. It's not...
I can't believe you don't know this woman. Said that she only ever uses homeopathy as a malarial prophylactic when she goes travelling, and on her family as well. And she said she's the only person who never gets ill, and she would never use anything else other than this homeopathy nodules, I think they're called, for malaria prophylaxis. When she said that, and that got reported in one of the big papers, and then it got mirrored and copied, and it went all around the web. So now when people Google for, malarial cures or alternative medicine for malaria, they'll find that really, really quickly. So that's why we respond to these things, to get our response out there as well, so that when someone Googles that, they'll see our response too. But it does more than that. We respond to these, or we get our scientists, scientists from our database. I see at least 2 people in this room who've helped us with this before, to respond to the science in the quote, not to the celebrity or anything, but saying, look, this doesn't actually make sense because this, and this. This is the insight that I have as a scientist that helps me to say what this guy said is nonsense. And we get that into our document and send it out to all the press, who love it because it's hilarious and it comes out when there's a dead news time. So it gets covered very, very widely. And as I said earlier, it gets into things like gossip columns and the NME when there's a music mags, and local radio stations and places where you'd never have these debates about science. So yes, that's one way of getting these tools of critical thinking and reasoning out there in all different places. There are many different ways of doing it, and that's one pretty light-hearted way, but I think it does do something. It makes a difference.
Okay, so we kind of touched briefly on earlier about the difference between science and skepticism, but I think I'd like to ask Kylie about this one first, and then you're welcome to chime in afterwards. But I find personally that when I mention, I'm a scientist, and when I mention the word skepticism, sometimes I feel like there's a little bit of a stigma associated with the word, and I'm not sure whether it's cool to mention it, or if I should, I'm talking to my colleagues about doing QED, like do I tell them it's skepticism, or do I tell them it's critical thinking? I was wondering how you feel about the term skeptic, because I know you're more than happy to use the term skeptic.
I find it interesting. I mean, my podcast is called The Token Skeptic, and it's often because I'll question skeptics. I might, for example, Bruce Hood, for example, who was speaking this morning, he, on his blog, which is a fantastic blog, and certainly check out his book, he mentioned how he saw a place for the placebo effect. And he wasn't too keen on people being so completely down on placebo effects and the placebo in the effort to raise awareness about the 1023 campaign. Mm-hmm. And he got a lot of lashback about that. And so I properly do what I always do, which is phone you up and say, hi, do you want to talk about this? And he did. And it ended up being a short interview called about hopeopathy rather than homeopathy. Yeah, so that's one of the things I like to do, to make sure that we even question ourselves, because I worry about the cult of celebrity, which can very, very easily end up with a Jenny McCarthy going forth and telling, parents who want to just find out what's best for their kids that they should not vaccinate. It's entirely possible that scientists can get it wrong at times. We're all human. Mm-hmm. And so I'm still slightly wobbly about the term skeptic. I say I'm skeptically minded, and I talk about skepticism as a process. But I know that I have people in my own hometown who are members of an Australian skeptics group, and they are global warming denialists, and this is what they promote. And so I ended up starting up my own skeptics in the pub just to have something different, because it ended up having quite a bit of conflict in that regard. I think it's still developing. I think that science is an incredibly strong and powerful and well-funded, certainly respected institution by governments and people in general, but I think skepticism's still got a long way to go, and we can all play a part in that.
One thing you learn if you've ever taught, I used to be a university professor, one thing you learn is that what they hear is much more important than what you say. Mm. And generally speaking, when you say, I'm going to a skeptics conference, people won't know what you mean. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yesterday on the airplane, or in the waiting room, I got chatting with another couple that was on the same plane as I was on. And they were saying, well, what brings you to England? Okay, well, I'm going, and I thought, okay. This is sort of like they say, and what do you do for a living? Well, okay. Where do I start? So I said, well, I'm going to a conference that's going to be dealing with critical thinking and science. Oh, that sounds very interesting. Okay. Now I can explain a little bit more. So, it's called a skeptics conference, and the context of skeptics in that sense is that we're skeptical about claims of the paranormal and medical quackery and applications of science that are questionable. That's kind of a quick elevator speech version of it. But you sort of start out with the science and critical thinking part because of two things. They don't know what the word skepticism means, and they kind of do know what science and critical thinking is, and those are both very positive terms. So if you're trying to communicate with somebody, you don't start out by kicking them in the shins. No, you start off with something that's positive, and then you lead them to what you want them to understand.
Yeah, I think that brings me quite nicely actually to discussing whether the best approach in terms of outreach, skeptical outreach especially, is the kind of assertive approach, let's call it, quite an active approach, whether it's more softly approach. So events like the 1023 campaign, which is of course going ahead as part of QED tomorrow. Events like that, do you think that, I'll throw it open to the panel, anybody who would like to respond can do. Do you think events like that are a good way of I'm not trying to just promote 1023 campaign, although of course...
But you all show up.
Yeah, you're all here anyway, so... do you think that's just one form of skeptical activism? Do you think there are different levels of when you should be more in people's faces, less in people's faces to get the message across? Do you think, I'm trying to think of the clearest way of putting this. I suppose the best way of putting it is, do you think that it's important to not be a dick?
Well, remember, there's gradations of that sort of thing. Yes. And there's also the distinction between a public event and a personal exchange. Okay. That's where Dickitude comes into, I think. Something like the 1023 is a public event. It's for publicity. It's to try to, you don't care who actually shows up to the event. What you want is who's behind the cameras and how many, outlets will carry it, because you want to spread the general idea that homeopathy is quackery. But you're more likely to get that message out if you're having fun, if people are enjoying it, if it's kind of an amusing thing. I don't put that in the same category as coming up to somebody and saying, "You're a homeopath? Boy, you're really stupid." I mean, to me, the bottom line is, what is your ultimate goal? I hope your ultimate goal is to persuade people to think like you do. Think about what's the best way to bring that about. Unfortunately, and I bring the experience of having dealt with the creationism and evolution controversy for a very long time, and have seen scientists defending science by debating creationists, which is a really stupid idea and I can give you a whole list of reasons why it's dumb to debate creationists. But an awful lot of those scientists were defending science because they just had big egos. Right. It made them feel good to pound that creationist into the ground. Well, of course, in general, they end up, being the Washington Senators to the creationist Globetrotters, if you know the basketball team, the Globetrotters, and they lose badly, but they still think they win. But if you're doing it for your ego, find a different hobby. If you are actually trying to persuade people to change their views on something like medical quackery or some sort of consumer thing that really does hurt people, then think about what's the best way to persuade. Whacking people in the shins tends to be unpersuasive. Providing people with a perspective that they find positive, a direction that they can head, is much more likely to bring about that eventual change in view. The other thing to remember is you're not going to change anybody in one pass. But if you can at least crack the door a little bit, maybe somebody at a later time will be able to crack it further.
I always remember, back to Monty Python, we had an example, John Cleese early this morning, People's Front of Judea. It's really good to get to, yes, and let's get angry and let's put things around the place and we'll be happy. And then everyone's like, why would I want to join them? They're just mad all the time and graffitiing the wall and getting themselves into trouble. You don't want to be like that. And then fighting over what's your name anyway. Have a clear goal and objectives and get organised. There are resources out there. There are examples, for example, social justice activism, political pressure, labour organisations. They do this all the time. Learn from those sorts of groups, and that way you'd be a little less like a Monty Python skit. Yeah.
I don't think being assertive is necessarily the same as being a dick.
No,
absolutely.
I agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I'm assertive, but I'm very jolly nice as well. I have personally, and the organisation I work for, have been described by some alternative practitioners as running anti-homeopathy campaigns, for example, and being vehemently anti-homeopathy, and I'm not. I don't really care what irrational things people do in their private lives. They can take unproven treatments, or they can pray, or they can dress up as Nazis after dark. They can do whatever they want. Nothing to do with me. But what I really get annoyed by is the official recognition of that kind of thing, when something is non-evidence based, but something like the NHS funds it or something like that. It's when there's this veneer of respectability and respect for no reason given to these unproven things. That's when I get angry and want to do something about it. That's why I work at Sense About Science. I think there isn't really a place in that kind of thing for euphemism, for being polite and being, to want of a better word, being a scientist and adding caveats to everything you say. For example, a couple of years ago on Sense About Science, we're putting together a project about radiation. A group of young scientists, young researchers that we worked with did a bit of myth busting and evidence hunting for some of anti-radiation and radiation protection products, including a pendant which is called Q-Link, I think, which we bought and took apart and turned out to be literally an empty box.
Yeah, we have the power balance bands.
That one as well. That was a good one this year.
Investigated a paper on
success
that. Yeah.
with that one. That was excellent. So when we got this empty box and we took it to radiation specialists, we took it to engineers and said, "It's an empty box. Look, it's an empty box. Tell us that doesn't work." And then many of the scientists said things like, "Well, I can't see a mechanism for it working," or "Yeah, the evidence that would work is a bit uncertain." And that's not very useful, is it? Putting that out there. for most people who haven't got a scientist would probably recognise that as a scientist being a scientist, adding a caveat to something, covering their back, saying I haven't seen all the evidence, I shouldn't really comment. But everybody else would see that as, so there might be something in it. Whereas there isn't anything in it, as the 1023 people would say. So, yeah, it is about being assertive, but it's about not living in. It's about not being a dick, but it's about not getting us living in a world of euphemism either. It's about being clear and direct and getting out there and responding to things strongly if you have to.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it's actually one of the things that the science communication researchers can actually speak to. I mean, there is actually research out there on being a dick and its usefulness in outreach. And in fact, the last 25 years of science communication research has been about this notion of what we refer to as the deficit model.
Yeah.
Okay, the idea that scientists essentially stand up at the front of the room and say, I'm a scientist, you're an idiot, you have to trust me,
Yeah.
right? And for 25 years of research, it's Bruce Hood mentioned this, theories are resistant. Scientists still believe that's the best way to get people to consider what they say. And there's, a phrase that's sacrosanct among skeptics. There's empirical evidence that does not work. And the UK government has actually been very good. There was a House of Lords report in 2000 that essentially said, this is not working. We've spent 15 years under what was called COPUS, the Committee on Public Understanding of Science, using that model, putting scientists in front of an audience, considering them idiots. We now need to move to something different. It's called engagement, right? So when you try to do skeptical outreach, you can run into the same sort of situation. If you treat everybody as an idiot, as a moron, and you're not engaging with them, then of course they're going to be resistant. They're going to be defensive. They're not going to want to listen to you when you talk.
So I think in that respect, I think that it's a good time to say that I'm going to ask the last question that I'm going to ask today. I'm going to open it out to the audience, and you can have two ways that you can ask a question. I believe we have a wireless microphone, so you can raise your hand. The other way is I have the QEDCon hashtag on Twitter in front of me. So if you don't want to raise your hand, I will say your name though, and it will be your Twitter name. Then you can ask me that way if I can see it in the flood of tweets. That's right. But just before I do, I'm going to ask one last question, which I would have liked it to be a slightly longer version of this, but since so many people raised their hands earlier when I asked the question about how many people consider themselves to do outreach, I'd like to raise a point that I was discussing with Kylie before the meeting, which is what role can individuals, groups or communities play in outreach? And I think due to the length of time, I think we'll try and stick more or less with individuals in this point. And I think we'll go with Kylie first, if that's okay.
One of the things that I think individuals seem to miss out on, and I hope people get back in touch with, is the traditional forms of making a statement about what you think needs to be improved. I think letter writing, email writing, letters to the editor, letters to companies, saying something to your government, it's sort of maybe fallen out of vogue a bit. And I'd maybe like to see more people as individuals sort of saying to themselves, well, I'm one voice that can have an impact, and I can collect enough evidence on this particular thing and bring it to my local school and say, look, I don't like the fact that you're bringing in this particular textbook that's promoting creationism in the classroom. Who else is with me? Being willing to take a stand on your own, and knowing that you don't have to be a part of a larger group to make a difference. Feel free to be independent and know that trickle can end up being a huge flood as Manchester gets more rain out there. Yeah.
And how does everyone feel about blogs in terms of outreach? Do you think that blogs are a good form of outreach? New media?
I think the science communicator might have a view on this because I know.
Well, I mean, I would say, I just wrote a cover article for the next British Science Association magazine. It's called People in Science, and essentially what they had me write on is, what is the next phase for science communication? And digital media have essentially turned all science communicators into media producers, right? Blogs, podcasts, videos, which often are music videos. When people do science outreach, they sort of combine a song with a video. these are amazing forms of outreach because they can reach much larger numbers of people. A guy I know who I interviewed for my book worked on the film Watchmen, made a video called The Science of Watchmen. And when I interviewed him, he said, I could teach 1,000 students for 1,000 years, and I would not have reached the same number of people that watched my video. Right? So it's an amazing tool for outreach, and certainly for teaching critical thinking skills is a really good way to go.
How do you feel about that, Sheila?
Yes, I agree. I have so much time for people who take the time to put together videos debunking claims from companies or products or something like that. But because it's scary out there. I said earlier I'm working on a campaign to reform the libel laws, and we know that scientists and bloggers in particular, and people who write blogs and tweet things, are very vulnerable to silencing and bullying by the libel laws. I was speaking to a guy yesterday. He's a young scientist. His YouTube name is Answers in Books. He put together, he has to be unnamed in public otherwise, he put together a video taking apart some claims of a water ionization company based in the States who said they can make water up to a pH 10 and how that will reduce acidosis, and how acidosis leads to the formation of pathogens, which is the basis of all diseases in the body, and how their water can basically protect you against all disease, which is, to say the least, gross misrepresentation of germ theory. But that's the first thing. So he put together this video taking apart their claims. He took some clips of their promotional videos and then responded to them, and it was a really nice video. I was really, really fond of it. It was excellent. Really direct and clear and just absolutely gorgeous. I'd tell you to go and Google and look for it, but you won't find it because it's been taken down. The company wrote to YouTube and told them that Answers in Books was breaching their copyright by using bits of their videos, and also they threatened him with a libel action. Neither of those things are going to get off the ground because he used clips of their video. He didn't change. I used it for commercial purposes. It was just fair comment. So I think there isn't a ground to that. And he didn't libel anybody. He was just responding to their claims. But YouTube had to respond to this, and they took down the video. And now he's frightened because the law means that YouTube had to give the company his contact details. That's the law when you get this takedown notice. So I understand, at least. And he's scared. And Sense About Science work to support people like that. So we're getting some big name scientists to rally around and to kind of back him up. But so short answer, yes, I really respect people who get out there and do this kind of thing, because I know how absolutely terrifying it can be when things go backlash against you. So don't be scared, though. If anything happens, call me. I'm here to help. I'll help. Just do it.
Are you on the mic facing okay. Okay, so while we're sorting out the mic for the room, I've got a couple of questions from Twitter. We're going to finish perfectly on time so that everyone can move between rooms if they need to. I'll let you know when that is. So the first question to the panel would be, how would you deal with a colleague who believes in homeopathy, reflexology, without ruining a professional relationship? And that's from Jin Che, who is somewhere in the room. At the back there, yes, thank you. So who'd like to start with answering this? How would you deal with a colleague who believes in homeopathy or reflexology, for example?
I can't answer that. I work at Sense About Science. I guess what I would do is, what I always do is make sure they understand that, give them the tools of scientific reasoning, basically explain what evidence is, what science is, what a clinical trial, what double blind is, show them the evidence, and if they're unmoved, then you're not going to move them. Just say, well, fair enough, hope you're happy, and move on.
I did have a circumstance where a fellow co-worker, and I used exactly the same thing. I did a bit of research onto what they're doing and just showed it to them and said, hi, make up your own mind. She was taking some sort of cold and flu tablets, and she couldn't figure out why she was feeling so incredibly hyper. And I said, do you mind if I have a look at those? And it turned out that there was so much caffeine in these pills that it was starting to really affect her. And that's why I said, look, I don't know if you realise this, but this is the normal amount of caffeine that you have in your coffee. This is how much you're getting out of one of these pills. And then I just said, you make the link. Okay? And that was it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, she was really grateful. Her husband was so grateful. He was like, thank you. He said, I couldn't figure it. I mean, I thought her cold was just going into some sort of realms of madness by the way she was. And she wasn't getting any better with her cold and flu, of course. But, yeah, the caffeine was setting on a huge high.
If you have a colleague, then it's like having a student in a classroom. You have more than one opportunity to deal with the difference of your opinion, so to speak. Be patient. Don't assume you're going to change somebody in one step. David pointed out very clearly, the research is crystal clear that coming in as a dogmatic, this is science, is not going to be very persuasive. You have to start where they are and bring them to where you want them to be. And it's going to be a process of small steps. Just Kylie's example is really good. This is a woman who knew about caffeine. She knew that caffeine makes you jumpy. Making the connection between something she already knows and something she didn't know is more likely to, bring about that realization that this may not be the pill for me. That general idea, start where they are, start with something that they're interested in, start with something that's meaningful to them. My own example in the creationism and evolution issue, someone who is trying to persuade someone who is a special creationist, that God did everything poof all at one time, is not going to be very successful talking about the body plans of the Cambrian explosion and their relationship to Evo Devo. Because the reason why that person holds the views about special creation is because there is a great deal of meaning, and there's a whole suite of social relationships and general emotional component to why they hold these particular beliefs. Shoveling more science on top isn't going to make any difference at all until that person gives himself permission to listen to the science. And the only way that person is going to give permission to listen to the science is if he's persuaded that if he changes his mind, he's not going to lose big. And I think that's a general thing when you're trying to persuade somebody away from an unscientific view toward a scientific view. You have to first deal with that underlying reality that, well, if you're right, what do I lose? Well, we have to persuade them that, I am right, and actually you will win big, without necessarily losing the things that are really important to you. That's all very, very abstract, but I think you get the general idea.
I really, really recognise that, actually. I think that's a really good point, starting where they are. And that's what we tend to do an awful lot. Like when we're working with patient groups, we were noticing a huge rise in calls that we were getting into the office, because anybody can call us when they have a query on a scientific or medical topic. We're seeing a huge rise in the numbers of patients and representatives from patient groups who are calling us concerned about unproven treatments being promoted for their members and their audiences. This is especially people with chronic diseases, so people with like neurological conditions like Parkinson's and MS, who, when they're given this diagnosis of this awful chronic disease, but not given a cure, they find themselves in this place where the natural thing to do is think, well, I've got nothing to lose by trying this. And that's where they're starting from. So that's exactly where we have to start from then, isn't it? And say, right, you do actually. Money and possibly help and so on.
I'll briefly add to that. I mean, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, that's exactly what you would want to do. And again, there's research looking at genetically modified organisms and people's attitudes. And essentially, when you ask them, why do you believe this? If you start initially saying, well, why do you believe homeopathy? Why do you believe this? You're much more effective in getting them to change their mind, because you ask them to think about their own personal belief system, and then you can shift them off of it. Whereas if you just come to them and say, well, you know what? The evidence shows that genetically modified organisms are safe and they should be used, they re-entrench because they've already got their belief systems. Right. So asking them why they believe is probably a good first step.
Right, I think if there's a question from the floor, we'll take that. Okay, if you have someone just there in the yellow t-shirt, okay. If you have someone specific that you'd like to direct it to, if you just mentioned that at the start, that'd be great.
Hi.
Alex is multitasking. Thank you, Alex.
Hello.
I heard you.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Go for it.
I just want to briefly follow up on that question, and then I'll ask mine. Is what worked for me in my workplace is I gave them my copy of Bad Science by Ben Goldacre. It opened to the chapter on why Big Pharma is bad, and once they read that, they read the rest of the book, and they went, "Oh, okay." So I mean, that was starting where they were, that Big Pharma was evil, and you've got a scientist saying, yes, I know. But my question is, in sort of, if you like, beating the homeopathy and this like that, how much what place do you think is on science education with children, whether children should be taught about critical thinking and the nature of science in science lessons, which they're not at the moment?
Actually, yeah, and I can tie that in with a question we had online, which is from Milton Line. I never know which way round to say it. Which was, how and should be better critical thinking skills be taught across all topics at school and uni level? So you've got critical thinking teaching in the classroom, the science classroom, but also how you feel about that in other non-science classrooms. So did you have someone particularly you'd like to answer that first? Mm-hmm. Eugenie, are you?
Yeah. Think of a layer cake, okay? We tend to look at science as sort of this, well, I don't know. Let me present an idea that I'm still working on. Top layer of the cake is science, okay? The next layer underneath that is reason. Science doesn't own reason, okay? It would be like saying, well, because historians use reason, scientists can't. Right. Now, reason is something that's common to lots of human endeavors. Okay, science being one of them. On top of science, well, I did this wrong. Science is the top. Let's just roll that back. Science is the top layer. Critical thinking is the second layer underneath that. Critical thinking is also not restricted just to science. Okay, reason underlies all of them. Science is built on critical thinking and reason, but we don't own it as endeavors that are only applicable to science. Any kind of scholarly field, whether it's French Renaissance art, or history, or science, or theology, or anything else, has to use reason. I mean, reason is very, very common to lots and lots of human endeavors. Critical thinking grows out of reason, and critical thinking, which is, in my opinion, that sort of basic process of finding information, evaluating information, testing that information, revising, going back and doing the same thing over and over, which is also part and parcel of what we call the method of science. Critical thinking is also not restricted just to science. So if we can help our fellow citizens appreciate not just science, because science is both a body of information as well as a methodology for coming about that information. But it's based on critical thinking, which we can apply to a lot of different endeavors, but reason underlies all of that. In the United States, and doubtless here as well, we have been beleaguered by the postmodernist movement, which began in the humanities and is now spread as sort of a general cultural phenomenon. The claim there is that modernism and Renaissance type of thinking has failed. Hell, it never got a chance. The whole notion of using reason to make up your mind is something that we actually need to get back to and give it more of a chance.
I think as a teacher, Kylie, I'm interested in your thoughts on this.
I think skeptics should work more with educators. I think we should be more in touch with what is being done for teacher training. I don't think there's enough interaction between educators and skeptical groups out there. Certainly there's a lot of excellent science teachers out there who are working and are probably unseen by many people in terms of what they're doing. And in many ways, I think that respecting the education systems out there and seeing how you can help improve them rather than just standing back and criticising and saying, you're not teaching anything useful to our kids. Well, maybe you should come along and talk to teachers more often, or see what's on the curriculums, or have a say before the curriculum goes into place. Then you can start making more of a difference. It's very easy to start pointing fingers and claiming, oh, the education system's ruining us. Well, maybe if you were there on the ground floor a little bit earlier, you could have had a bit more of a say, and hopefully more people will be encouraged as educators to get in touch with skeptical groups out there. Yeah.
I think that's a positive note to end on. And I'm going to have to end because it's getting to that time where we have our 10 minutes in between, so you can all make your way nicely, if you wish to go to the Ghost panel. In this room, we're going to have a screening of The Ghost Who Wasn't There, but I'd like to thank the panellists who've been fantastic. It's been a real honour.